Well, Brother Adam has asked that we introduce his consideration this morning, to which he will be speaking, "You shall have them for food," by taking a brief reading from Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 to 30, and I'll just read that for you. Thank you, Mary Ann, for that beautiful meditation. And at this point, I'll hand it over to you, Adam, and looking forward to your words. Thank you.
Well, good morning, brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all, and it would be great to see everybody. So if you're comfortable, then it would be lovely to see you all with your cameras on, and I invite you to certainly share in a meal together. Don't be bashful. Start eating, and at some point I may even do the same. I bring the love of your brothers and sisters at Castle Hill to each of you, wherever you are. And if you haven't yet pulled together something to share as a meal, then perhaps go and grab a piece of bread or a cracker and a bit of cheese, and we will share together. So thank you, John, for the introduction. Thank you, Paul, for the prayer, and thank you, Mary Ann, for the excellent choices of both hymn and meditation song. So we're going to start this morning by having a bit of a think about Daniel chapter 1. So if you've got a Bible nearby and near your food, then it'd be great if you had that opened, or at least try and pull Daniel chapter 1 into the forefront of your memory. Now, Daniel chapter 1 it's a fascinating study in really the conscience of a disciple, because the chapter is quite intriguing. It's we're sort of parachuted into a scene of chaos and uncertainty. But more importantly, we're really parachuted into the consciences of Daniel and his three young friends. And we're really sort of parachuted into trying to understand how they arrive at some discipleship decisions. And so as the curtain draws on the scene of chapter 1, we're aware, of course, that Daniel and his three friends have been forcibly abducted to Babylon, and the empire has vanquished their homeland, the homeland, the people of God, the place of God. And so we've just got to be mindful of their very recent experience of Jerusalem under siege, with all the deprivation and fear that would have entailed. They've been witnesses to the conquest of their capital city, and so too their nation. And they had been personal participants in, of course, deportation. And so obviously their lives are in turmoil here. Perhaps friends and family that have been that they know have recently been killed by Babylon. Certainly they would have had fear for their life and uncertainty about their own future. They've just completed a journey of some 2,700 kilometres, most likely on foot, as they head from the nation of Israel to Babylon. So despite their privileged position in the palace, which must have been quite remarkable, they're still men who have been forcibly removed from their nation and their family. Their liberties, of course, are lost, and now they're forced into this lifestyle of service to a foreign king. And their circumstances are far removed from ours. And in fact, they're probably far removed from the vast majority of people throughout all of history. And yet Daniel chapter 1 exists. So though the circumstances are remarkably different to ours, we've got to kind of say, well, what's the point of this chapter? Well, how can we transition what's happening into this chapter out of those circumstances and make it relevant to you and I in what is a radically different setting? And so we're automatically, with that question in our mind, we're automatically going to try and observe the underlying messages of this chapter as we read of these four young men who really go about a process of identifying and shuffling in their own mind their priorities. The chapter reveals their thoughts. It confesses their reasons for their decisions of conscience. And we really become a party to how we see these four men, how we can observe their consciences in action. Now, as we jump into Daniel chapter 1, it appears in like intentional writing to me that firstly, we are told what these men accept before we're told what they reject in Daniel chapter 1. And it's not just mere context, because I think what they accept in their newfound position is as much a revelation of their conscience as is it a revelation of their conscience to think about what they rejected. So let's just first of all think of the three pretty significant things that they accept. First of all, their role. Their role is to serve, of course, the king, and they accept that. And to, of course, in turn serve that nation that has just beaten up their own nation. The nation that had vanquished Israel, had taken goods from the temple. And just think about, well, how does that play into their thinking? What can they draw from in the Bible that helps them to kind of work out if this is okay or not okay? Now, though there's a bit of history of Joseph serving in Egypt, this circumstance is not similar at all. This is kind of an unprecedented event. There's not a lot for them to draw upon to instruct them as to how they should deal with this. Egypt hadn't just destroyed Israel like Babylon had just destroyed Israel if they were trying to segue out of the experience of Joseph. And yet Daniel and his friends, they decide it's not a matter of conscience for them. They decide it's okay to accept this role of service of Babylon and the king. There doesn't seem to be a conscience issue expressed in Daniel chapter 1. I think that's interesting, because as Christadelphians, we generally practice a very cautious approach to even voting in a benign local council election. And their conscience is unoffended by the role of serving the political world superpower. And you'll recall that upon graduation, they take up the senior position. The four of them are found to be the best. And they take up the senior position before the king, no doubt one of political engagement. The second thing they accept is their education. And no doubt a Babylonian education would not be limited to just kind of learning the local language, and maybe they're great authors. It's going to contain a biased history of how it's the most superior nation. It's going to take, that education will contain information on this culture, on its cultural practices, on religion, on religious worship practices. We know it included things like magic and witchcraft and astrology and what we might term non-spiritual spirituality. And again, for the young men, well, what do they got to draw upon as a Bible precedent? There's no Bible precedent for this kind of deep embedding within the fabric of a nation and someone becoming immersed in its culture and education and practices. Perhaps the only thing they could draw from was Moses, but they don't choose what Moses ended up doing when he found himself in that situation. He ended up murdering someone and going on the run. They don't choose that as their response to this situation. And once again, as Christadelphians, we are cautious about embedding and immersing ourselves into the fabric of society. We're careful about going on a jury, becoming members of clubs and associations, or we're careful about taking on a role as the spokesperson for a particular interest group or the representative of a particular part of society. And yet their consciences appear unoffended by this role of deep involvement, embedding in the culture of the day. And finally, the thing they accept is, of course, we read of the new names. And we get it. We understand that names are really important biblically. They're intentional and they usually contain spiritual messages. And Babylon choose to, of course, change those names with the intent to mock or deride or diminish these four men. The names dishonour them as they are names that praise the gods of Babylon, of Bel or Nebo, or remind them of their status as the king's servants. And perhaps for me, what's more interesting is not that they take on the new names, but they accept the rejection of their old names. Now, their old names, each one of those names have a reference to Yahweh within those names. And so not only do they accept the new, but they're happy to reject the name of God, which is embedded in their own names. Now, I've tried to think of a segue example to ourselves, and in a modern day comparison, perhaps the only thing I can think of is our fervour to retain the name Christadelphian. We very much like the way our name distinguishes us as a community, as brothers and sisters of the Lord Jesus. But again, the consciences of these four men are unoffended by either the putting off of their distinctly God-centered names, and nor are they offended by the new names with their demeaning spiritual barbs embedded within them. Now, I don't know about you, but at face value, I could easily reach the conclusion that any one of these three things would be of a greater issue to my conscience than eating food. Serving the king who had just destroyed Israel, tough one. Subjected to an education of false religion and nationalism, or being forced to detach myself from God. And every time someone talks to me and mentions my name, it's either a reference to a false god or a demeaning comment about me being the slave of the king. Surely that would be more of a challenge to my conscience than eating food. And perhaps their decisions that we can read in Daniel chapter 1, perhaps they're even out of step with the decisions not only we would have made then, perhaps they're even a little out of step with the decisions we make now as a community. And I stress, I'm not pushing a barrow here. It's just an observation as we read through Daniel chapter 1. So given what they accept, well, our attention is immediately drawn to trying to figure out, well, why is it so much more offensive that they eat the food? Why is that the thing that pricks their conscience? And again, I just want to dismiss two, I think, common reasons that we say, or that I've heard people say, is the reason that they choose to not eat this food. Why is it? And the first thing I want to dismiss is the idea that the king's food included food that was prohibited by the law. You know, this idea that there was unclean food and they couldn't wrap their heads around that, and that's why they said no. Now, it's true that no doubt the Babylonian diet included foods prohibited by the law of Moses. However, I think the main objection to this view is that the law, of course, does not prohibit drinking of wine. And you'll note that that's as equal issue for them. They don't want to eat the king's food, nor do they want to drink the king's wine. No Levitical issue, no law issue around drinking the wine. And yet they do. The second objection to this view is that the law is only possible to be fully kept in Israel and within an ordered system of priests and temple worship and in the land. So the ability to keep the law properly was already lost to these four men. They just couldn't keep it irrespective of food. And if they were keeping it, we've got to think as best they could. Like the law, by the end of Daniel chapter 2, Daniel's the head over sorcerers and witches, and yet he doesn't choose to undertake the command in the law that you should put to death all sorcerers and witches. And so he simply does not keep the law, and nor can they keep the law when outside of the land. So to hold this view that this view about rejecting unclean food, we need to accept that somehow these four men, it was right for them to part keep the law. That hybrid law keeping is what they were trying to achieve, that it was okay for them to cherry pick bits of the law and to adopt bits of the law and reject other bits of the law, that this was an honourable or right decision in itself to do cherry picking law keeping. So I'm not convinced that it was about unclean foods. The second idea is that that's often presented is this idea that food was offered to idols. Now, the main objection to this view that it was offered to idols and so they couldn't handle eating it is that there's evidence that all food in Babylon was offered to idols. It wasn't as though for some reason the Babylonian gods were not thanked or acknowledged when it came to vegetables, as though only a suckling pig was offered to idol and not the apple that's in its mouth or the vegetables that accompanied it. And so it's hard to sustain that idea that the food was offered to, that this food was offered to idols when we know that all foods were, including vegetables. And perhaps a secondary objection, and maybe even a note of warning, is that this idea of food offered to idols is largely a New Testament idea. And so if that's our thinking, then we're sort of dragging a New Testament issue to try and understand an Old Testament scenario, which we, of course, need to be careful about. And so we're left to determine what is the matter of conscience here for the four men. What is the reason that they choose not to eat this food? And in a way, it's actually not very difficult to work it out when we note the emphasis in the text. And this is what Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 says. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. Can you see what the issue is? I mean, it's leaping off the page. The issue is that he would be eating the same food and drinking the same wine as the king. Daniel and the king would be eating and drinking together. They would be sharing a meal. And look, I haven't done an exhaustive check on this. I've done a quick sort of Bible software check on this, but I've just looked at that word there in verse 8 of defile and just checked whether or not it's the same word when speaking about defiling the law, and it's not. When it's a unique word. And so when it talks about in, say, Leviticus 11, that you don't defile yourself by eating insects and creepy crawlies, it's not the same word as Daniel says when he says, I don't want to defile myself. Again, in Numbers, when it says the leprous person's to be put outside the camp so it doesn't defile the camp, not the same word as Daniel uses. And finally, when it says in Deuteronomy that a body cannot stay on a tree overnight lest it defile the land, again, not the same word, not the same idea, that, or at least the same word that Daniel uses in Daniel chapter 1. And so the word also, it seems, doesn't appear to resonate with the idea that Daniel was concerned that he would defile himself under the law. And so the issue, I think we can comfortably resolve is that it's not the nature of the food, it's not whether it's kosher, it's not whether it's offered to an idol. The issue is the nature of the activity. He was eating with the king. He was not prepared to do what we're all doing now, all of us, virtually, wherever we are. He wasn't prepared to share a meal together. And that is the matter of conscience that takes centre stage. Of all those incredibly challenging things that were put to those four men, they sift through all of them in their mind, all of those challenges that were in front of them, and they land upon just one being of such spiritual significance that it triggers a conscience reaction and it triggers action of all those things, of all those challenges. And so, as we now eat together, I think it's important to try and appreciate what it is that pervaded the thinking and the conscience of Daniel and his friends. Just what is the biblical background to coming to that point, to making the stand over food? Because frankly, the food would have been the very last issue for my conscience. So just what is it that makes it a matter of conscience for them? Now, we read Genesis chapter 1, a few verses there, and of course it's a book of firsts. Hang on, I'm just going to have an olive, just hold on. No. No. So Genesis is a book of firsts. The first words of God in verse 3, let there be light. And so too, the first, our reading had the first words of God to humans. So the first time that God speaks is let there be light. His first words to men and women are be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But have you ever seen what God's first gift to men and women was? It's his first stated gift to Adam and Eve, and by extension, his first stated gift to all of humankind. It's in the verses we read. Behold, I've given you every plant-eating seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. Of course, God does an amazing creation. He creates all these things, and his first words are, let there be light. And his first words to people are, be fruitful and multiply and fill. And then his first gift, intentionally stated, is food. And so begins an intimate relationship between God and humans around food. As God says, you shall have them for food. And is that what Daniel thought about in Babylon? Did he think about God's first gift, that first shared meal in history? Throughout all of time, the first meal was one shared by God with Adam and Eve as he gave them food to eat. Now, the test of faithfulness for Adam and Eve, it required abstaining from food, didn't it? And so you'll remember that they were asked to abstain from just the one tree. But soon we find Eve, well, she does share a meal, but she doesn't share this meal in the presence of God. She shares a meal in the presence of a serpent. And that meal, with God absent, has catastrophic consequences that resonate right through to today. And so is that what Daniel thought about? The consequences of eating with a serpent and excluding God from a meal. And then God reminds Noah as he exits the ark. He repeats the words from Genesis chapter 1. He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill. And then the very next words are that the animals and the plants are given to him for food. With one development of the idea, except no longer the blood of an animal, because that represents life. And so the new creation, after the flood, commences with this reiteration of God sharing food with men and women. Is that what Daniel thought about in Babylon? This continued gift of food and the spiritual significance of blood from the earliest times of history. And then a representative of God, a priest, Melchizedek. Well, he meets Abraham and he shares bread and wine. And so Abraham, he shares a meal with God as well, with God's representative, God's proxy, with Melchizedek. Is that what Daniel thought about in Babylon? That first patriarch, Abraham, eating with God. A little later, Abraham shares another meal with God as he appears while Abraham is by the oaks of Mamre. Yes, 3 angels, but they shared a meal with Abraham. And when they spoke, it says, the Lord spoke. The Lord is present. They represent God. And those 3 make promises of fruitfulness for Sarah as though they are God himself. And now, is this what Daniel thought about in Babylon? A meal shared with God where the promise of a son in just a year's time is confirmed. Now, Daniel's people had been in a land captive before, hadn't they? And a great deliverance had occurred then. But that great deliverance didn't start with the parting of a sea. It started with a meal that is described always as the Lord's Passover. Now, this meal wasn't shared with God, for God passed over the house if it had blood on its lintel, in which people were gathered sharing a meal. But the meal celebrates the relationship. The meal and all of its requirements and customs is from that moment forward the reminder and the evidence of the relationship between God and Israel. It becomes a feast to the Lord, and its 7 days of celebration and keeping of customs makes them a holy assembly, separate for God. And so the Passover isn't just a celebration of an ancient delivery from slavery. It's not like just looking back to a historical victory. The Passover, it's feasting, it's unleavened bread, the shared lamb. It's a reminder that God is still with them. Not that he was with them, he is with them. And the meal shared is the reminder and the evidence of God's presence. Is that what Daniel thought about in Babylon? God's relationship with his nation and people is embedded in a shared meal. A little later, God establishes a series of laws that are to guide an entire nation. And the laws are pretty broad. There's some civil laws and administrative laws for the nation. There's instruction about things like how to deal just between humans on various matters. Sensible laws of how to administer a nation. Some provide even instruction on how to deal with people from outside that nation. How do we deal with a foreigner? But when it comes to the laws that are all to do with the relationship between God and an individual, all of them turn on, all of them center on food, animals and plants. At its most basic level, the law places food as the central activity or springboard to a deeper connection and relationship with God. Burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, the consecration of Aaron and his sons, offerings after giving birth, offerings when you've recovered from leprosy, the Day of Atonement, all of them, animals and plants, shared food. This first gift from God to humans becomes the very gift or offering that unites God and humans again. The laws of relationship between God and men and women all turn on food as it's shared. And so is that what Daniel thought about in Babylon? Forgiveness and relationship with God centers on food shared. And of course, it's a constant reference throughout all the Psalms. Psalm 136, he who gives food to all flesh, speaking of God, for his steadfast love endures forever. And thanks, Marianne, for the hymn from Psalm 23, my table you have furnished, even in the presence of my enemies, my foes. Still you're looking after me, God. You've even put food on my table. Is that what Daniel thought about in Babylon? That food is the direct extension of God's chesed, his steadfast love. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Daniel thought about all of these things, whether consciously or subconsciously. The sharing of a meal is significant. It runs deep in the veins and the psyche of Daniel and the young men. It's just too simple to say sharing a meal in ancient cultures is important. That's true. Sharing a meal is culturally and socially significant, even today. A birthday, an anniversary, a wedding, a girls' get-together, a catch-up with someone who's going through tough times, all usually accompanied by involves the sharing of a meal or coffee and cake or nibbles and wine, whatever it is. Yes, food is culturally and socially important. That's a general truth. But for a Hebrew, there's additional depth. Shared meal has echoes to God's first gift, the first meal shared in history, God's promises, God's deliverance, God's way of connecting and being in relationship, God's presence, God's chesed, his steadfast love that endures forever. And so for Daniel and his friends, we must be cognizant that sharing a meal is entirely linked to God. Food and drink is central to the connection and even the presence of God himself. Sharing a meal isn't a horizontal experience with the people around you. Sharing a meal is a vertical experience as you connect with God above. So a shared meal goes beyond friendship. A shared meal goes beyond social and cultural norms. A shared meal even goes beyond friendship or fellowship amongst people, because a shared meal includes God. He's the central idea to a shared meal in every facet, as the meal provider, as a reminder of delivery, as proof of relationship, as evidence of his interest and presence, as demonstration of his steadfast love. He's present in a shared meal. God and a meal are inseparable ideas. And so, for Daniel and his friends, there is no place at the table for the food and the wine of the king of Babylon. There's only one king that they want at their table, and that's Yahweh. Now, all gospel writers make a similar reference when speaking of the Last Supper. And it's only just fully resonated with me in literally the last 48 hours. And in a sense, they're innocuous words. All four say, and as they were eating. Matthew says, and as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. Mark says, as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus says, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. And can you see the drama in those words? As they were eating. That's the context that should leap off the page. As they were eating the most important meal of the year, that has embedded within it all the deeply significant spiritual ideas of a shared meal with God, that when shared is the celebration and proof of divine unity and deep connection around the table. During that meal, that one, at that time, the Passover, Jesus reveals the impossible notion that there could be someone at the table who was going to betray him. As they were eating, betrayal is present. And so the disciples are completely perplexed by the incongruity, the impossibility of that. as they were eating the Passover meal, there's a betrayer amongst them. And perhaps Jesus' words resonate a little more when Luke says that Jesus comments thus, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Of course, this Passover that we celebrate now, of course, it was the institution of the Lord's Supper. Of course, it's the time that there's a new covenant made in the custom of the bread and the wine. That of course that happens. But don't you sense more than that? Jesus says, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover, to share this meal with you, my disciples. It matters to Jesus that they are sharing a meal. And it's on that foundation, that shared meal, that thing that matters to the Lord Jesus, that he introduces bread and wine. And today, we've shared a meal together in kind of virtual comfort. It's been great seeing you all here as I look at all the squares, seeing you all eat and drink there. And that's what we've done today. We've shared a meal together. And today we're reminded that Daniel and the young men were unable for conscience sake, to break from their relationship to God that was embedded in the activity of sharing a meal. And today we're reminded that God is long engaged with men and women via a shared meal. And today we're reminded that the Lord's meal was earnestly desired. He earnestly wanted to have that Passover with his friends that united his friends and him and God in a meal. And today, of course, we're reminded that the Lord looks forward to and anticipates his next meal. He says such. He says, this is my last meal, but I'm looking forward to the next meal that he will share with his disciples in the kingdom. And now we're reminded that it is upon this incredibly rich spiritual foundation that the Lord takes bread and wine. He builds greater meaning, richer spiritual symbols, another layer to a shared meal. And so, as we are eating, we focus on bread that represents a life that has been lived in a manner that is compelling and beautiful and inspiring. And as we are eating, we focus on wine that represents, yes, the terrible method of his sacrifice, but so too that magnificent idea that life is in his blood. Matthew 26, verse 26. Now, as they were eating, that is, as they shared a meal, the Passover meal, the meal that Jesus greatly desired to have with his disciples, that meal, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them saying, drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Amen.